There are no clear and definite records about the exact date and place of birth of Idi Amin Dada, but it is widely believed that he was born in Uganda sometime in the mid-1920s. There is a claim from one of Amin's children, Hussein, that Amin was born in 1928. Other accounts, however, have put it as 1924 at the latest. Even though we don't know exactly where he was born, it is most probable that he was born in Koboko, located in the northern part of Uganda, which is predominantly Muslim and near South Sudan. The notion that he was born in Kampala, the capital city, is most probably a myth. The origins of the claim about Amin Dada's father remain ambiguous and unclear. Some accounts state that Andreas Niabire, the father, was a Kakwa. He became known as Amin Dada and later practiced Islam instead of being a Roman Catholic in the early 1900s. On the contrary, some sources indicate that he was of the Nubian tribe, who possibly practiced Islam when he was young. In all likelihood, if the family tree above is correct, the family was probably Sudanese with some elements of the communities that Emin Pasha, the governor of the Ottoman province of Equatoria toward the end of the 19th century, shifted further south. Pasha, as early as in the 1880s, explored to the very southern ends of Uganda. Amin's mother is also controversial when it comes to her origins, identified as a lady known as Asa Ate. She could have been from the Lugbara or Kakwa tribe, who occupied the present-day territories of northern Uganda. A few facts regarding Idi's childhood suggest that he was brought up by his mother only because the father had deserted them. This was in the early 1940s when he was at an Islamic school in Bombo, while the Second World War was taking place in the northern and eastern parts of Italian East Africa and the Maghreb. The history of colonial rule in Uganda is particularly important as a starting point in any assessment of the life of Idi Amin Dada. Uganda, like many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, was not born cohesive in terms of ethnicity or religion, but rather out of the imagination of its colonial powers. Long before the advent of colonialism, there were several populations in the region where the present country is located. The Ugandans, the most populous group in Ugandan history, occupied most of the southern region of Uganda and encircled the capital, Kampala. However, the region also housed a considerable population of Sudanese individuals in the northwest, a number of Nilotic tribes, namely the Kakwa and Lugbara, in the east and northern regions respectively. Some inhabitants of the Kuliak tribe can be found near the present-day borders of western Kenya and eastern Uganda. The effect of religion on the existing divide also made matters worse. While some were adherents to Uganda's traditional beliefs, a section, especially in the northern regions where Islam was brought by Egypt and the Sudan, were situated Muslims. Many others introduced faiths such as that of the Protestants and the Catholics. These differences in race and religion constitute modern-day Uganda. The late 19th century saw the British occupation, also referred to as the Buganda Kingdom, which at that time occupied a great deal of the territorial space. Imperialists, especially British ones in Africa, who wanted to control from Cairo to Cape Town, created the Uganda Protectorate. The increase in the internal political differences within the country is a result of the British colonial regime, which tended to favor Ugandan conversion Protestants and use them to wield power in the country and oppress the Muslims in the northern part of the country. It is undeniable that colonialism was used primarily for extraction, but its benefits also come with some counterpoints, such as the rise of economic and physical infrastructure in the region, and cash crops like cotton and sugar being installed. Most countries experienced a quality improvement in literacy toward the mid-20th century. The creation of the military of Uganda was another significant event during the colonization period. In the earlier years of the 20th century, this colonial regime commenced the recruitment, armament, and training of Uganda natives. This process gained much steam in the gearing up for and during World War I to conquer the East African German territories, which included Uganda. Amin mainly fabricated later stories that he served in the British Army during the Second World War and fought in the theaters of war against Japanese forces in Burma. He climbed the ranks quite fast in Kenya after the war. His capability in sports and military service won him many friends in the British officers' circles, who considered him quite popular, which helped. Consequently, he advanced in the ranks of the Kenyan African Rifles as fast as was possible for a black man during those colonial times. By this time, he had relocated to Kenya, which was much more supportive of anti-British sentiment and activities compared to Uganda, where he originated from. For this reason, Amin happened to be around during the time of revolts orchestrated by the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, also called the Mau Mau, against the British colonialists in the late 1950s. As a matter of fact, he demonstrated great performance in this Kenyan initiative, although he would later try to downplay his involvement in this struggle, which was intended to perpetuate the British Empire. Above all, he was also promoted. For example, in the next year, he advanced from a corporal to a sergeant. During the 1950s, Amin was able to contain some of the successes. Amin's commanding officer in the KAR, Ian Graham, later recounted that among the officers and soldiers he ever served with, he could rank Amin as one of the exceptional common soldiers and mid-ranking commanders. Graham also penned an autobiography that detailed his experiences in Uganda, as well as with its future dictator. This perspective was affirmed by other officers in the police. It was about this time that they began transferring him back to Europe for more military education and posted him in Stirling, Scotland. This, as we shall observe, initiated a chain of events that would see Amin even thinking about becoming Scotland's king. The next year, in 1959, after returning to Africa, he was conferred the title of Effendi, also pronounced Afande in Kiswahili, by the KAR. For this reason, he was advanced in rank in the East African British Army to the highest class attainable by an African, the class of warrant officer. Nonetheless, there were also early warning signs of trouble in the future with Amin. In the early and in the late hours of the day, he beckoned the KAR to curb the rampant cattle rustling along the Kenyan-Ugandan borderline. At this time, Amin ordered his forces to kill a number of villagers. When the question of Uganda's coming independence from Britain came on the table, he was saved from a court-martial for this civilian offense by Sir Frederick Crawford, who was trying to avert a scandal involving one of the two native Ugandans. As commissioned officers, they participated in the colonial army. Amin was working for his promotion in the ranks of the colonial British Army in East Africa at an epoch of distress in Africa. The Allies in the West agreed to the signing of the Atlantic Charter, which promised them some degree of freedom and self-rule over their colonies after the Second World War. There was also the issue of how the victors of the war would deal with their colonies, which meant that many, if not most, of the African territories would be self-governing states by the mid-1900s. Southern and eastern parts of the continent were under British occupation, while the majority of the northern and northwestern part of the continent was under French control. The countries of Italy held most of the East African arm, plus Libya, while a large section of Africa was owned by Belgium in the Congo. Around Mozambique and Angola, there were two large blocks owned by Portugal. After the battle, not very much happened to allow these enormous colonies to be set free, but by the 50s, the impetus had become unbearable to the extent that these colonies had to be set free. Consequently, France was able to relinquish her hold over Morocco and Tunisia, and after that, everything changed pretty fast, especially the year 1960, when all these countries went free, including Madagascar, Côte d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, Chad, Senegal, Togo, Mali, Benin, Niger, and Cameroon from the rule of France. At the same period, the colonies of Belgium were also lost, and the countries of Rwanda, Burundi, and Congo were born. Between the two regions under British protectorate, Ghana and Nigeria, Britain returned them all to self-government in 1961. To some parts of Northwest Africa, specifically in East Africa, a few years later, there was decolonization. It was somewhat similar to other nations further to the northwest, in that it began in Uganda and its neighboring regions. Many of these other countries had native structures that had been created prior to colonization. More often than not, they had gone to school in either London or Paris before coming back to their countries for self-governance. In Uganda, by the late 50s, There were calls for independence, but very few organized cleavages or active political entities. As a result, the change of power in Uganda on the 9th of October, when the Republic of Uganda was proclaimed, was characterized by the absence of a political environment conducive enough for power transfer. Soon, however, three major political organizations came up: the Kabaka Yeka, a Ugandan nationalistic party; the Democratic Party, which was for the Pope's followers in the country; and the Uganda People's Congress, UPC, which was largely for the Nilots in the north. The People's Congress and Kabaka Yeka collaborated in Uganda's first post-colonial elections to stop the Democratic Party from coming to power, resulting in the appointment of Milton Obote, the leader of the UPC party, as the first prime minister of the country. Subsequently, Obote went on to dominate Ugandan political affairs for the next several decades, but his reign was characterized by most of the issues which troubled other African countries just after their independence. That is, the problem of integrating the British-created artificial nation of multitudes of people with different ethnicities and religions. There were conflicts in the mid-1960s between those who believed that Kampala should run an aggressive unitary state and those who believed that the Nilotics, Baganda, and other groups should have their own provinces and a much more flexible federal state. Such an event marked the apex of the conflict, with Obote declaring a state of emergency on constitutional order and acquiring sweeping powers, more or less a dictatorship, in the month of February. Nevertheless, such occurrences in Africa soon after independence were not strange, to say the least. The 1960s saw the rise to power in different parts of the continent of brutal dictators, like Joseph Mobutu in Congo, Jean Bokassa in the Central African Republic, Francisco Macias Nguema in Equatorial Guinea, and Abubakar Sangoulé Lamizana in Congo-Brazzaville. It used to be a part of Upper Volta, a present-day country, Burkina Faso. It can thus be noted that when Obote came into power in Uganda in 1966, the country was headed for darkness. Amin thrived during the time of Obote, when even the country's central authority became stronger. Upon the early independence years of Uganda, he was rising through the ranks of the military establishments. Upon the attainment of independence by Uganda in 1962, he was elevated to the ranks of captain, major, and deputy commander of the military in 1964. In 1965, aged 40, Amin at last received a commission as one of the commanders of the army. He reached the summit of the Ugandan military and thus became the general commander of the Ugandan army. An important portion of the dynamics of his rise in the 1960s was due to his active participation in the dirty games played by Obote in Uganda. Most dictators who came to their countries during that era also established kleptocracies and managed to collect incredible wealth for themselves by robbing and depleting their countries in the process. In the mid-1960s, Amin assisted Obote in the trafficking of illicit gold and ivory goods across the border of Congo and Uganda. A significant part of the income from this project was to be used for arming the rebels and separatist groups in the DRC, which was the plan of Obote, Amin, and their other allies. The fact that he and Amin were involved in smuggling was a critical factor that made Obote act authoritarian and take complete control of the northern part of Uganda in that year. Around that period, toward the end of the 1960s, Idi Amin had assumed one of the most powerful positions in Uganda. Gradually, however, it became clear that the regime headed by Obote was becoming increasingly oppressive. In 1969, an attempt to murder the dictator failed, and a wave of terror was chosen instead against political or military opposition across the country. Amin was much involved in these measures, as he was the enforcer for Obote. However, looking back, it seems that Amin had some designs of seizing power for himself in the late 60s, or at least consolidating his control over the military, which was still loyal to Obote. To be precise, he was recruiting and appointing a lot of fighters from the northern parts of Uganda, namely the Kakwa and Nubi ethnic regions, which share borders with Sudan. Such people were also Muslims, and the same ethnic group as Amin. He was therefore swamping the Ugandan army with recruits in anticipation of an imminent takeover of the same by Osama. In addition, it may be argued that Amin was trying to gain the support of Israel and Britain for this operation. The United Kingdom had great interests in East Africa and its territories, including Uganda, and was concerned about Obote's heroism and socialist policies during the Cold War. For Israel's part, it had an interest in Uganda during the 1960s, intentionally to exploit time and space distractions from the countries that bordered the Sinai Peninsula, which were Sudan and Egypt, as they were in occupation of entrenched Sinai. Amin's plots finally bore fruit in the early 1970s. By that time, aware of what power Amin might wield, Obote dismissed the general from the overall charge of the Ugandan military in October and took that role himself. He set about making fake documents to prove that Amin was involved in financial misconduct, but his procrastination in executing his plan led to his failure. Despite Obote's strategy, Amin did not waste time and set out to thwart the president. On January 25, 1971, Amin executed a coup d'etat while Obote was attending the heads of the Commonwealth countries meeting in Singapore. Amin quickly took measures aimed at securing the capital Kampala and the key means of communication, especially the radio stations. This allowed Amin to inform the nation that he was replacing the corrupt Obote long before the president, who was thousands of miles away, had a chance to reply. The general took it upon himself to be the protector against the contravention of the Constitution. He argued that he was going to be in power for only a few weeks or months, while the country was prepared to resume normal democratic activities. Obote would, in the course of the 1970s, return to Africa, but reside in neighboring Tanzania in exile. Amin would rule for 8 years, which were among the most brutal dictatorship regimes in Africa. Within a few weeks after the almost coup-less overthrow in January 1971, Amin was already consolidating his power in the whole of Uganda. He did not just proclaim himself as the new president, but also reinstated his position as the general commanding officer of all the Ugandan forces on February 2nd. The new regime turned into a military rule almost instantly, with no time to make believable the maintenance of the previous constitution and legal structure. The court system was mostly replaced by military courts, appointing hot-headed supporters of Amin's army to various senior political and civil administration jobs for which they were largely unqualified. Amin rebranded the government headquarters in Kampala as the Command Center before he imposed all the laws. Following this, Amin undertook large-scale massacres of the armed forces and civil administrations to promote himself as a dictator. He and his military regime discharged thousands of people from their positions and brought in only disciples. And in case the Amin regime of Uganda came into power after the spates of violence that characterized the 1970s, these people were often killed, besides being removed from their offices by the government. The ways of Amin, who usurped power, were not appealing to everyone. As we know, Milton Obote went to Tanzania in 1971, like an eagle to the south of Uganda, which is bigger and richer. In this instance, it was Julius Nyerere of Tanzania who had been in full support of Obote and who did not pledge recognition to Amin's Ugandan administration. In addition, up to 20,000 did not stay in Uganda but rather trekked down to the south of Tanzania years and weeks later to get political asylum. They soon turned into well-trained guerrilla units who sought to defeat Amin's regime. Among these fighters was a young Yoweri Museveni, who also found himself in military activities that shaped the political scene in Uganda. Finally, a few months after this coup, some of these plumbers' exiles made a move in September. In an effort to execute a coup similar to the one Amin had staged within the year, about 1,500 militants crossed the northern border into Uganda. The coup would be conveyed to the public by taking control of the major radio stations, the central city, and Entebbe airport, situated before Kampala, Uganda. However, these plans came to nothing. Amin was aware of the impending invasion. In fact, he had it called off, planting the seeds of real international involvement only at a very early stage. Within a few days, 100 invaders were dead. And yet this is an important indicator of the extent to which Tanzania would play its part in the events that followed. The beginnings of Amin's reign were marked by utmost optimism within the international community.
The British and the Israelis were inclined to stage a coup against Obote, for they were of the opinion that a former KAR officer, whom they saw as Amin, would be much easier to handle than the dictator. It is not surprising that they were quick to become the victims of their own naiveties, as Amin was more than willing to depict this very early period as that of a man who would seek to resolve Uganda's political, tribal, and religious conflicts in its entirety. Such was the situation in July that the president was said to have enjoyed goodwill visits to Israel and to Britain. During his visit to London, he dined with members of the British royal family, including the Queen, and met Prime Minister Edward Heath. On top of these, the state visit came in handy for him to pitch a tent back in Scotland, where he had been trained during the 1950s. There was something about this country that endeared him.
He would later christen some of his sons with Scottish names, and even dressed one of Uganda's army regiments in Scottish traditional kilts. For, as it later became apparent, he even entertained a notion involving a bizarre collaboration with a private military company from Scotland in the mid-1970s. This was on the back of him asking to become a king of Scotland. Amin requested additional arms from both London and Tel Aviv so that he could expand his warfare to Tanzania, but was denied by both countries. In a curious turn of events, it seems that both the British and Israeli capitals did not fully appreciate the person they were dealing with when Amin paid them a visit in the summer of 1971. Rather, it is about their dealings with him that they mention having had earlier presuppositions, only to later come to the realization that they had been wrong. In July 1971, while dining at Buckingham Palace and refreshing his memories of Scotland, Idi Amin Dada did not know that two Americans, a journalist called Nicholas Stroh and a sociology lecturer, Robert Seidler, were in Mbarara Army Barracks. They were interested in some of the political assassinations that were beginning to occur as Amin consolidated his power over Uganda. Against the council's warning, they did their best to get in, a choice which at long last proved disastrous. Both of them died at the barracks. America was fast to respond, offering to investigate and sending out one of its own legal experts, David Jeffries Jones. Shortly after arriving in the country, Jones ascertained that the two had been done away with by Amin's soldiers. But he left the nation before the findings were published because he was scared for his safety. The killing of Stroh and Seidel served as the first clear sign that Amin would not be the puppet dictator that the West hoped he would be upon his arrival in Uganda. There were, however, more overt signs of trouble presented by Amin. After the authorities in Tel Aviv and London denied his request for additional and advanced arms, Amin attempted to reach out to the self-styled president of Libya, Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi. Gaddafi's rule, which began in 1969, helped him to position himself against the former colonizers. He had not only expelled a big part of the Italian settler community, took over Western military installations that were key to the Cold War, but also attempted to incorporate some aspects of Islamic Sharia law to the country. Hence, Amin's aspirations to ally with the ruler of Libya were seen as a cause for alarm. Moreover, during his visit to Libya, in a bid to solicit Gaddafi's military backing, Amin also gave an imaginary picture of himself and his country. For instance, Amin presented himself as a strong Muslim and appears to have convinced Gaddafi that 70% of Ugandans were Muslims, while in reality, the percentage was much smaller, about 6%, most of whom were in the northwest part of the country, which borders Sudan. Nonetheless, Gaddafi was somehow won over by Amin's claims, and after the promise of weapons from Gaddafi, he made Gaddafi accept Uganda in the Organization of Islamic States with the promise of the oppression of Christianity in Uganda. In 1972, back home in Uganda, the reign of terror led by Amin intensified. It specifically victimized the Acholi and Lango ethnic groups that were in opposition to Amin's oppression. By the early hours, at least 5,000 victims, including local politicians, military personnel, lawyers, school children, and clergy, had gone missing. Bodies were often seen in the Nile River. This was, however, at a time when the foreign press remained largely unbothered by events of this nature. Nonetheless, a specific event regarding Mutukula, which is close to the border with Tanzania, attracted much attention within the month of January because it spread beyond Tanzania's borders. The bloodletting, however, did not stop as the Western foreign services and media at the time ignored the happenings in Uganda. Research regarding the levels of deaths and displacements during Amin's rule is prone to sensationalism. An estimation of the number of deaths during the events by the summer was in the tens of thousands, those who were either killed or had to seek refuge in either Tanzania or other countries. In addition, there was also a growing threat of people dealing with political and religious oppression. Things would only go from bad to worse in the coming years. The incident occurred in the fall of 1972 and mainly targeted the country's large ethnic Asian minority, and later made the dictatorship of Amin known to the world press. East Africa has been home to Indians and South Asians and their colonial activities for centuries, at least since the 11th century. The first phase of globalization started in the latter part of the 1800s, and by the end of the Second World War, there were more than 500,000 Asians, mostly Indians, who had settled in East Africa. There were not only huge populations of Asians in countries including Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Mozambique. However, it was also believed that the growth of the Asian community in Eastern Africa encroached considerably upon the economies of the states in question. In the year 1950, concepts of race began to change in Uganda as more and more people of Asian origin settled into the country. However, judging from available records and reports, about 80 to 90% of Uganda's commercial activities and industrial work were dominated by the Asians settled in Uganda. Agriculture was the other sector to which the Indians contributed significantly. For instance, cotton-growing ginneries in Uganda were owned and run by companies of Indian origin. The strength of the Asian community not only manifested in the political dynamics of the nation, but also in its money. Apart from English and Arabic languages spoken in the region, the British Empire also made sure that the East Africa shilling banknotes were written in Gujarati. This was demonstrated through His Excellency President Amin's earliest proclamations and speeches after assuming office. Therefore, he announced on the 4th of August that Asians in Uganda who are not Ugandan passport holders or do not intend to become citizens shall leave within 90 days. Upon independence, the British government had come to terms with the fact that because these people were British subjects, they should be allowed to become British, to emigrate to Britain. Many of the tens of thousands of Asian non-citizens who had been expelled from Uganda naturally looked to Britain as a refuge. Even so, some sections of the British ruling class were apprehensive that tens of thousands of Ugandan refugees would be allowed into the UK. Cautiously and attentively, the government of London, headed by Edward Heath, sought to dissuade Amin from pursuing his strategy and also to defer the execution of the expulsion order. It is worth noting that by the very beginning of November, there was widespread panic as the ultimatum approached. Eventually, 27,000 Asian American Ugandan exiles were flown emergency to Britain by the United Nations air evacuation, which was organized on very short notice. Amin's intentions regarding the deportation order had been apparent long before the state dislodged, forcibly or otherwise, hundreds of thousands of people. More often than not, the trip to the borders, and even airports, stripped the deportees of all their possessions. Those on the inside who dared to resist national policies, for example, Chief Justice Benedicto Kiwanuka, met with the most sordid ends. Kiwanuka was instrumental in Uganda's quest for independence. He took on a short-lived role as a technocratic Prime Minister of Uganda after the country had been allowed to govern itself just before Obote's electoral success in the early 1960s. In 1971, at the start of Idi Amin's rule, he released the man who had been held by Obote's government since 1969. Initially, he sought to work with the new regime, which is why he was first made the Chief Justice of the country. Nevertheless, he was arrested in September 1972 because he spoke against how Amin was treating Asians, among other things. On the 22nd of September, he was executed at Makindi military prison by Amin's army. Such was the cruelty of Amin that he killed him in such a ruthless fashion. His mouth was cut out. His nose and ears were also severed. His digestive organs were removed from his body, His reproductive organs were cut off, and he was set ablaze. The months and years that followed the downfall of Uganda's economy showed another important aspect of the exodus of Asians from Uganda. The 50,000 to 60,000 Asian Ugandans that were evicted dominated nearly every aspect of the country's commerce and manufacturing. These firms were quickly run by the military supporters of Amin. These people, however, were often some of the least trade-literate or even numerate individuals, which made it impossible for them to run the enterprises that they took over. On the estates, the machinery for the production of crops finally ceased to operate, and they could not be repaired. No one had ever utilized a cotton gin that had become stuck or broke down again. The most ludicrous example of total economic ineptitude is perhaps that cement factories established in Tororo and Fort Portal did not work. In the center of the 1970s, therefore, the economy of Uganda did not exist. Price increases occurred because there was a deficit of several goods which these factories had produced, or they had to import more of them. The Ugandan economy virtually imploded under the regime of Idi Amin, while inflation rates increased steadily. Years after the expulsion of Asians from Uganda, Amin started asserting himself more and more in the international arena. Most British citizens had the grounds to vacate the country by the end of the year, and after that, Amin had pitched the capital some more in London after the expulsion of 14 High Commission officials, who were sent to supervise the new state after British colonies had released Uganda. Colonial rule ended in 1962. Notwithstanding this, and the increasing external pressures being exerted against Amin's regime by the Western nations, it was indeed very interesting that almost on a daily basis, jumbo jet crafts departed Stansted Airport in London, carrying large amounts of luxurious goods for Amin and some other officials in his regime. Targeted trade sanctions against Amin and his associates were ineffective when it came to the so-called whiskey run. Around this time, similarly, Amin was becoming more dependent on Libya and the Soviet Union and spoke out against Israel, who was also a previous ally, for its aggression during the Yom Kippur War in 1973, as well as against the Western nations for siding with the apartheid regime in South Africa. This estrangement from the West reached its climax in Kampala when a summit of the Organization of African Unity, of which Amin was the leader, took place under his auspices. There, he humiliated British Foreign Secretary James Callaghan, who had flown to Kampala to pressure Amin into releasing British author Dennis Hills, who had written about the Ugandan dictator in a book called The White Pumpkin and was facing deportation. Some people publicly voiced complaints about him, causing a pushback at the reception. There was also a scenario where Callaghan returned believing Amin was cooperative. But it was the British government that decided to spare the British man who had been condemned to death before Callaghan's intervention. On the contrary, however, Amin kept associating more and more with the USSR. By the end of the regime, Moscow had given millions of dollars in bullets and aid to Amin, and had also dispatched thousands of Ugandan soldiers to military camps in Eastern Europe. The Soviet regime wanted to win Amin's favor in order to offset the anticipated inroads made by the Chinese in Tanzania and the British in Kenya. In the mid-1970s, Amin maintained contact with a certain Scottish paramilitary body, which has been the subject of a recent book and film, among others. This was the moment when Amin's unmistakable love for Scotland caught the eye of the Scottish National Liberation Army, which had recently been established. This petty group had, within a short time, started sending letter bombs as a mild form of terrorism in their homeland. Certain elements overseas, wishing to separate from Great Britain, saw Amin come forward to proclaim himself King of Scotland. If true, this would mean that Amin would be the first monarch of Albion to rule directly and from abroad for nearly a decade. The most outstanding aspect of this very different man was that it was but a postscript to Amin's reign as a Ugandan dictator, which later gained glory with a book and a movie featuring Forrest Whitaker and James McAvoy. Bizarre as it may sound, it was, however, a fascinating illustration of his deepening lunacy. As all this was happening outside, the regime remained adamant in its draconian tactics at home during the mid-1970s. Amin and his followers discriminated and oppressed some Ugandan ethnic and religious communities, all the while putting others in the forefront. The despot paid attention not only to the Baganda ethnic group, which centered around the region southwards of Lake Victoria and the city of Kampala, but also appealed to his own ethnic groups, the Kakwa and Nubians in the northern regions. Likewise, Amin favored the small Muslim minority and awarded them preferential treatment for this same reason. However, Muslims only accounted for 6% of the entire populace. For instance, approximately 80% of the highest ranks in the military and administration were dominated by Muslims in the late 1970s. The same state, however, managed to persecute many other religious and ethnic groups, specifically the Acholi and Langi in the northeastern and eastern parts of the country, respectively. As the mid-1970s approached, failures of extremely thousands were still terrorized with murder, destroyed from their places and lands, faced humiliation along with assaults, violence, and incarceration. In fact, Amin had transformed the already powerful Ugandan army into the military nobility of his followers, who ruled the country through expansion to the extreme degree of tyranny. The tyrannical rule was made possible by Amin's secret police, which he established shortly after seizing power, known as the State Research Bureau. However, from the mid-1970s, Robert or Bob Assels has for a long time been known to be working on just that task. Assels was the old colonialist, a British officer and a soldier who had served in Africa after the end of the Second World War. 13 years went by, and having spent the latter part of his life in Uganda, he eventually chose to settle down in the country following independence and joined Obote's regime. He was locked up for a short time by Amin in 1971 after his seizure of power, but he somehow managed to win the trust of the dictator, which led to his appointment as the head of the State Research Bureau in the 1970s. The Bureau during Assels' time was also charged with exposing plots against Amin and the regime, and bearing the responsibility for the disappearance of thousands of so-called criminals. Over the years, streets of Kampala and various cities of Uganda were filled with people being pushed into car boots and driven away for good. In the mid-1970s, Amin's mental condition began to decline, and he seems to have depended on Assels as one of the few people he knew who was not scheming against him. Amin's conduct and lifestyle were indicative of his increasingly unpredictable behavior in the 1970s. The despot had no less than 6 wives in a polygamous relationship between the 1960s and 1970s. In 1974, he parted ways with 3 of them. In the subsequent months, 2 of them died under peculiar circumstances. Then, of course, he had a £2 million ostentatious wedding and took as his wife a 1-year-old go-go dancer, Sarah Kayolaba, with Yasser Arafat being the best man. He fathered up to 50 children in total, and perhaps even more, with several of his mistresses. Instead, Amin accumulated more and more palaces and stylish houses all over the country, many of which housed some of his children with varying degrees of involvement. At the same time, while older, having been a healthy young athlete, he fit himself into a formidable figure when his age stretched to the 50s. Not many would begrudge him the paranoia that there were conspiracies against him, given the circumstances, but that often descended into plain insanity. Later, Bob Assels spoke of how federal agents rang him because of his belief that he had calmed down what he termed an out-of-control Amin. Having had syphilis in his younger days and probably suffering from tertiary syphilis, leading to some degree of dementia by the 1970s, it seems this particular ailment, along with others, greatly affected his character and behavior when he ruled the nation of Uganda. This may also shed light on some of his odd actions and the allegations of cannibalism that trailed him in the final stages of his rule. In the late 1970s, a certain Israeli doctor who had worked in Uganda announced that Amin was suffering from a serious case of syphilis which had affected his brain. Perhaps it also elucidates a telegram Amin sent to then UN Secretary-General Kurt Waldheim in that particular period, in which he praised Adolf Hitler, the leader of the German Nazis, and claimed that it was gaslighting that caused the Holocaust. The contents of the message reached global leaders, and it became less and less doubtful that a partially insane person had been given power in Africa. However, Amin's appreciation for the German excesses during the Second World War crippled his final reserves of support from the Soviet Union, or what was left of it in military and economic terms. One of the incidents that is considered as the watermark of cruelty associated with Amin and his regime made the situation even worse. On June 27th, that summer, an Air France flight from Tel Aviv to Paris with a stop in Athens was hijacked. Upon its diversion to Entebbe Airport, in the southern part of Kampala, the media was quick to realize that the unwarranted intrusion was part of a plot in which Amin was in cahoots with Palestinian terrorists and the West German terrorist group calling themselves the Revolutionäre Zellen. In the ensuing hours, the kidnappers let go of the non-Jewish passengers of the plane and called for the release of a number of Palestinian political prisoners imprisoned in Israel, daring to kill the Jewish captives before July 1st. However, what took place was in fact a bold operation of theater. Israel commanded forces in Uganda rescued all the hostages from the commandos who took off from Israel, after one stop to refuel in nearby Kenya. The Israeli commandos controlled Entebbe Airport many years earlier, which gave them detailed knowledge of its layout. Thus, on July 4th in the late hours, Israeli commandos carried out an almost absolute surprise assault, in which they rescued the majority of hostages, crippled almost all Ugandan Air Force jets stationed at Entebbe, and in a matter of minutes exited Uganda. The operation lasted only a few minutes. The fact was clear to Amin. He was angry and puzzled the day after everything that took place. Unlike any other leader, he retold each of these events using colorful narratives loaded with antics, theatrics, and descriptions that defied belief. Amin, in his lengthy speeches, claimed he was helping the national cause in extremis. It was understood that there was some cooperation between the Israeli New Life Rescue Mission, who were releasing their captive countrymen in Entebbe, and the Kenyan authorities, who permitted the refueling of their aircraft in Nairobi. Amused would be an understatement for the state of the Kenyan leaders towards the baseless patriotic sentiments of Amin about their heads of state. A large portion of Western Kenya had already been part of Uganda's protectorate by the British. After independence, Kenya was able to reclaim these same territories. However, around the mid-1970s, Amin began to introduce a rather absurd notion that this region, located in the western part of Kenya, actually belonged to the Greater Uganda, which is Ugandan territory. Moreover, this certainly would have contributed to the decision made by the authorities in Nairobi to support the Israeli rescue operation in July 1976. Still, it did not come without repercussions, as in the weeks that followed the Air France episode, Amin killed hundreds, if not thousands, of ethnic Kenyans living in Uganda in retaliation. By the mid-1970s, religious leaders in Uganda had begun to express their concerns over the government's strategy of pitting one religious community against the other, Christians against Muslims. Amin had suppressed a number of Christian denominations, while at the same time courting the Muslim community. Then, Janani Luwum, the Archbishop of the Church of Uganda, held a meeting with religious leaders from the Anglicans, Roman Catholics, and Muslims inclusive. He had been a prominent figure in the campaign to ease any potential religious conflicts. At this meeting, it was resolved by all present that efforts would be made to avoid any further escalation of religious conflict in the country. However, Amin was later informed of the gathering, which he had not been privy to, and had Luwum arrested on fabricated charges of preparing and instigating a coup d'etat. It was on February 17, 1977, that the international media, so to speak, put Luwum on a diet. The next day, a statement was made by Amin's regime declaring that the Archbishop had passed away in a car crash. This, however, was not the end of the story, as people did not buy this fallacy, and further accounts claim that Amin may have gone as far as shooting Luwum. Thus, the people's inaction substantiated the view that the Archbishop had suffered from diabolical injustice. Another sign of how deranged and cut off from the rest of the world Amin's regime had become was his exclusion from a meeting of Commonwealth heads of state not long after. It was the actions of individuals such as Luwum and the other religious leaders that showed how Ugandans who had supported Amin's government were starting to change their attitudes. This was true for the ranks of his government as well. The Uganda Kingdom Finance Minister, Emmanuel Blayo Wakweya, had also managed to escape to England while in London. However, the Health Minister, Henry Kayemba, had a much more serious defection in 1977. In a very short time, Kayemba prepared a comprehensive internal portrait of the regime and became the author of A State of Blood, a book that viciously exposes the horror and carnage perpetrated by the regime of Idi Amin. The global public opinion against Amin and his regime did little to help him in the administration of Uganda, but again it never resulted in him losing power. As long as he kept a tight grip on the civilian government and the army in the country, Amin was not in danger. Nonetheless, this situation was changing gradually. In recent years, a rift arose within the Ugandan armed forces between those who remained staunch in their faith for Amin and those who were in favor of General Mustafa Idrisi, the vice president, instead of the lunatic that Amin had become. It is prudent to recollect that Amin was aware of Idrisi's rising power, and hence, there was a deadly conflict that would lead to his demise. Relations between Uganda under Amin and southern Tanzania, at least at the surface level, were cordial for years, but often not without hostility. Milton Obote had been a political exile in Tanzania, while a few of his loyalists undertook the ill-fated invasion of Uganda from here in the autumn of 1972. At the end of the 1970s, however, it became the cause of Amin's very downfall. Early one winter, Idrisi's supporters rebelled against the regime in southern Uganda, near the border of Tanzania. It is probable that, having added the conflict with Tanzania to the violent internal strife in Uganda, Amin was forced to wage war upon Tanzania to avoid an inevitable defeat within Uganda and exercise greater hegemony over the nation. Perhaps he took this reluctant step because he hoped to take credit for the movement into the interior of Tanzania after he recognized that he was no longer in control of some of the army's units along the southern border. One way or another, Amin had a good beginning concerning the Uganda-Tanzania war. By the year's end, Amin was bold enough to declare his desire to annex the northern Tanganyika region of Kagera after the invasion of Ugandan troops into the area at the start of winter. Nonetheless, 1979 would prove to be a watershed year. In January, the president of Tanzania, Julius Nyerere, began to mobilize the Tanzanian People's Defense Force in order to avenge the attacks from the north by Amin's soldiers. There was also a large group of Ugandans opposed to Amin's regime who had been living in Tanzania as exiles and were recruited there as well. Along the way, certain sectors of Amin's troops started to disintegrate and began to retrace their steps to the south. A few units moved westward and entered Zaire. In the sequential order of the seasons, winter made a retreat, and the month of March 1979 breathed life back into most of the people who were retreating towards Kampala. Despite seeking help from Saudi Arabia and Saddam Hussein's Iraq, Amin received no considerable international help as he had expected and had to contend with only minor help from Gaddafi's Libya and the Palestinian Liberation Organization. The Lukaya conflict, fought on the 10th and 11th of March in the southwest direction off Kampala, was the last and most pivotal battle of the war. An army of Ethiopian and Ugandan exiles, with limited runway support but huge numbers in the infantry, fought against a division of 2,000 Ugandan regulars and 1,000 Libyan troops supported by armor. Many encouraged Amin to read the writing on the wall and step down from his position of President of Uganda in the hours following the loss and the news of it reaching Kampala. Until the very last moment, he remained defiant within Kampala. He even refused to surrender and consequently fired his military chief of staff, Yusuf Gowon, as forces loyal to the exiled veterans of Tanzania and Uganda were advancing onto the city of Entebbe, located to the southwest of the capital and encircled by the waters of Lake Victoria. On April 11, 1979, the date widely accepted as marking the end of Idi Amin's brutal dictatorship in Uganda, he found himself escaping from Kampala by helicopter as his supporters and loyalists thinned out, and the enemies drew closer to the capital. Still, Uganda, in the months that followed, did not enjoy peace instantly. Political parties in Uganda were a tool of ethnic-based interest groups who, rather than focus on the delivery of service to the citizens, engaged in power politics. It was for these reasons that military intervention was seen as the only relevant solution to the stalemate in Ugandan politics in 1980. This would lead to a provisional military junta, but Paulo Muwanga, who took arms to fight for the overthrow of the secular regime in 1971, after declaring a state of emergency, turned out to be an interim military governor who encouraged a move towards elections and civilian rule by the end of that year. Later, these elections led to the leadership of Milton Obote as the newly elected president of Uganda. However, there were many who opposed this government and actively campaigned against Milton Obote coming into power through the elections. Many groups contended that the Uganda People's Congress, led by Obote, was responsible for election irregularities, which, it must be noted, they may have had grounds to believe. Thus, as time elapsed and as Obote was to be sworn in for a second presidential term, a civil uprising and insurgency erupted in Uganda, led against his regime by forces who believed their cause was just and rejected any form of government dictatorship that the regime sought to represent. The regime and the forces led by Museveni, opposing it, fought in what came to be called the Uganda Bush War for more than 5 years. Finally, Obote fled Uganda in 1985, when Museveni and his associates began gaining the upper hand. Viewed with images of present-day Uganda, the enactment of Museveni's swearing in as the new president, who had previously left Uganda for Tanzania in his 20s, years before being sworn in as president, was significant. Crazy things happened when Museveni and the national resistance movement encroached Kampala. Uganda did not experience a new beginning with the ascendancy of Museveni and his national resistance movement back in Kampala. Not only has Museveni been in power since then, but he was also re-elected in January 2021, thus becoming one of the longest-serving heads of state in history. He has stayed in power ever since. Ugandan politics, however, have deteriorated, with minority persecution and human rights abuses becoming the order of the day. This unsigned Bush War in Uganda, however, took place in the 1980s, and most importantly, Museveni was not a part of it. Most of the blame rested on Amin regarding the bloodshed, which took place in the 1970s. Regardless of the fact that no reliable census data existed to determine how many people perished under the regime of Idi Amin, because of the dispersed population, internal displacement, and violence that targeted anyone within the country who expressed dissent. Estimating the death toll attributable to Idi Amin's regime is a challenging task. Furthermore, it is not always easy to agree on what should be measured. Thousands, and even tens of thousands, of people disappeared during these years in Uganda, not as a result of a government directive, but rather due to the fact that Amin created a state where military leaders were permitted to kill anyone they fancied, as he himself was above the law. The death toll was also enhanced due to the mismanagement of the economy. Amnesty International and most critics acknowledge today, these shortcomings notwithstanding, that during the years 1977 to 1979, at least 300,000 deaths were recorded owing to the dictatorship of Idi Amin. However, some evidence derived from census recreation suggests a decrease in population statistics by figures ranging between 420,000 to 800,000 individuals. While it is difficult to ascertain the precise figure, one thing is for sure: the reign of Idi Amin in the 1970s was undoubtedly one of the most brutal regimes in Africa, and worse still, it inflicted untold pain on the citizens of Uganda. After raising Kampala, Amin did not make an immediate exodus from Uganda. He enjoyed a few weeks in the east of the country and even unsuccessfully tried to declare a rival administration with Jinja, a city by Lake Victoria, as the headquarters of the new regime. But real politics caught up with him, and he left the country, moving at first to Libya, where he enjoyed the hospitality of his erstwhile friend, Gaddafi, who helped him escape the limelight. From there, Amin moved further east and found himself in the city of Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, where the regime gave him political refugee status. After he settled in the city, he gave his first interview after the loss of power, speaking about the control he had over Uganda and claiming that the people in his country wanted him back. Amin would never go back to power or occupy an important role in the political life of Uganda ever again, despite the fact that he journeyed to Zaire, where he attempted to fly back to Uganda, which was in the middle of a huge raging war that had effects on a number of bordering nations, including Uganda. When Amin envisioned chaos, the order before his return to the country had drastically broken down by the end of the 1980s, and he hoped to find the adverse circumstances advantageous in mobilizing support for himself. Some months later, following the mission's failure, Amin flew back to Saudi Arabia, having lobbied the government to allow his return over the insistence of the US and other countries. Amin never set foot on Ugandan soil again and lived in Saudi Arabia for the remaining years of his life. He was advised to avoid the media and television talk shows. He remained fairly active around his villa in Jeddah. In his final years, he attended many entertainment events, worked out in the health center, and even had massages. Amin often traveled in different automobiles, such as a Range Rover and Caprice, and regularly visited the airport where he would receive goods usually cleared for him. Though there was a flight of cassava and other East African foods to Jeddah in the 1990s, it was not as luxurious as the whiskey runs that brought cash from Stansted Airport to Kampala in the 1970s. Curiously enough, during this period, very few courts around the world ever called for the prosecution of Amin for war crimes. Lastly, in the summer of 2003, when he was 80 or very close to it, his family disclosed that the former dictator was suffering from kidney failure and was in a coma at a hospital in Jeddah. There were requests for his body to be brought back to Uganda for burial, although the authorities warned that he would be charged if he attempted to enter the country. Consequently, Amin died in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, on August 16th, and following the disconnection of life support, his burial was performed without anything spectacular. Idi Amin was undeniably a ruthless dictator. His regime, from the very beginning, rather than attempting to unify the citizens inclusively, ruled Uganda by maintaining regional and ethnic conflicts within the country to control its inhabitants, further expanding his autocracy. Working towards a strong Uganda as one people in the post-independence period. The years of the 1970s saw the regime, which was increasingly headed by an individual who had always been unscrupulous, excessively violent, and who in all likelihood suffered from some form of syphilis-induced madness, repress enormous sections of the population. The number of deaths that can be attributed directly to the government cannot be stated with certainty, but a very conservative figure would put it at nothing less than 300,000. Its extreme negligence in executing economic policy starved hundreds of millions, if not billions, more. Morris used to be quite the popular figure, but that changed extremely fast. When he wanted power and reinstated himself, he tried to start civil wars in neighboring countries with Uganda in order to garner support for himself back home, which was a losing gambit, especially for the types of groupings Amin had cultivated as his support base. The policy did not work, however, and soon there was a war with Tanzania that resulted in the overthrow and exile of Amin a year later, bringing his 8-year regime as one of the most brutal dictators in Africa to an end. Nonetheless, the events of Amin's ascent to fame and the factors which facilitated this ascent clearly illustrate the failure of the decolonization process on the African continent in the post-World War II era. After completing British training, Amin rose through the ranks and achieved leadership in the King's African Rifles. It is worth noting that despite the atrocities committed by Amin towards the Ugandans during their bid for independence, some tact in politics was utilized in the resolution not to prosecute him. Instead, the matter remained unresolved, and no court-martial was convened thereafter. Unfortunately, this is how far the sensibility in the lesson on Brenner's regulatory role in the regime could extend, and he was unable to prevent the rise of the dictator. Or maybe that could have saved him from self-imposed exile. Later on, and for their own political considerations, Both Israel and Britain provided assistance for Amin to overthrow Milton Obote. Such tarnished and short-sighted considerations were among the key reasons why both camps of the Cold War sponsored and supported despots like Amin and Joseph Mobutu to emerge and persist in power in Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, during the African post-independence period. However, those who were involved in placing Amin into power did not foresee the outcome. Countries like Kenya, which even to this day enjoys relative stability, were driven into madness by a mad ruling elite and their mad supporters. In the process, they were dragged into a senseless civil conflict, and tens or hundreds of thousands of Ugandans perished, with thousands more becoming refugees. Though Obote lost power to Amin, he still enjoyed life in exile without any charges pressed against him by a foreign tribunal. What do you think about Idi Amin? In your opinion, was he the most savage dictator on the continent after the post-independence era in the 60s and 70s? Cheers, and we appreciate your watching. Do drop a message in the comment section.